Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My sound was not quite on. I started a bit early. It's a pleasure to welcome you. If you're coming in, don't hesitate. There's still a few seats over there, so don't stay by the door. Please come and join us. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon to introduce this annual event showcasing the European Commission's analytical report on employment and social affairs. It is the well-known Employment and Social Developments in Europe review, the SD review. The 2024 of the SD review focuses on an aspect that is also quite high on the new European agenda. It does look more particularly at social convergence and the role of social investments. And we will have 3 dedicated panels this afternoon focusing on various aspects of this particular topic. We will look respectively at how social investments and reforms can boost employment, social inclusion, competitiveness, and economic growth. So we do have quite a lot on our agenda, and we've also got a whole range of very committed and very dedicated, but also expert speakers to join us for these 3 dedicated sessions. If you wish throughout the program to check on the agenda or on the lineup of speakers, you will have a QR code that you can scan throughout the program, and that will take you to the program, to the agenda, so you know who's speaking when in case you've lost track at some point. We've also got quite a few of you following us online, so welcome to all of you following us through the web stream, because our session is web streamed this afternoon. If you are in the room with us, you will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of every panel. We're going to try and save some time for you to ask your questions to our speakers, so get ready, and we hope that we can establish some interaction between you and our speakers. Now, before we dive into the heart of the matter, I'd like also to make a quick reminder. This particular event is seen as a lead-up to the well-known European Employment and Social Rights Forum that's going to take place in the spring of next year. Not quite the spring, but we'll come back to that in a little while. You'll have all the details and the dates so that you can already save them on your calendar for next year. You'll hear about all of that, plus all of the topics I've already mentioned in the upcoming sessions. And to introduce that, I'm handing over to Carlo Martuscelli, Politico moderator.
Good afternoon. My name is Carlo Martuscelli, and I'm Politico's European economy reporter. And you're watching Politico Live, the live extension of our nonpartisan journalism. Competitiveness is a word that you hear a lot in recent times. As Mario Draghi recently made clear, Europe is falling behind its rivals in the US and China. In the past, competitiveness was often a byword for an aggressive restructuring of the labor market. That meant making it easier to hire and fire workers, more flexible work hours, and sometimes even reduced wages. But this time around, experts are putting a different emphasis on competitiveness. The conversation is centering around the world of high tech, of industrial policy, and of research and development. And for all of these, Europe is going to need more highly qualified workers. Still, there's no doubt that in the most recent commission, there's somewhat less of an emphasis on the idea of a social Europe. Instead, focuses firmly on reviving economic growth. In the panel that's coming up, we're going to discuss how the European social model can be complementary to competitiveness. For example, by training up the workforce to keep up with the breakneck pace of change, and what, if any, tensions there are with the search for growth at all costs. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce our sponsor, DG Ample, for making this event possible. And I'd like to give a warm thank you to our audience who's joining us both online and in person with me in the room here. We like to make this event as interactive as possible. So you can participate by tweeting about it with @LivePolitico, and you can also ask questions through Slido using the hashtag #PoliticoSpotlight. You know who we are, and we want to know who you are. So we're going to be prioritizing questions that are sent with a name and an organization. You can already share your thoughts and answer the following poll. What's the best tool to boost the EU's employment rate and productivity? And we'll look at the results at the end of the panel. But before we dive in, I'd like to give the floor to Mario Nava, Director General of the Directorate General for Employment at the European Commission.
Good afternoon, everybody, and many thanks for being here. I feel honored and excited to be here and to stand before you. This is quite an important event that we are organizing. What we want to look at today is look at the vital role that social investment plays in fostering upward social convergence and in boosting growth and competitiveness. You will see that the agenda today is packed. It's packed with insights, it's packed with results, it's packed with things that we have been producing. Actually, we believe that we have been producing some sort of cutting-edge research in DG Employment on exactly the significance of social investment. You will see the program unfolding in three different parts, looking at the interconnected themes of social investment, upward social convergence, and more competitive economic performance for the EU. And the panelists that we have gathered, and I want to thank them for having accepted our invitation, are as diverse as possible. So I believe we have the basis we need for a very good conversation. Actually, in DG Employment, I believe we are keenly aware of the significance of social investment and the importance that social investment brings to competitiveness. So it's not a truly new conversation in academic and intellectual circle, but it's a conversation that it has taken a while to percolate down to policymakers. I think it did at the end, there is no doubt. I think that today the EU ability to prosper and unlock future growth, many people would admit that depends on the ability to gather all the forces from all our society, so from the inclusiveness and therefore to get the full competitive potential of the society. How have we achieved that? There are at least three things. One is obviously President Ursula von der Leyen various strategies outlined in the political guidelines. The second is the already mentioned Mario Draghi report, where the link and the insight between social investment and competitiveness could not be clearer. And third is that during the previous Spanish and Belgian presidency, I think we made some advances through an informal working group on social investment. And after several months of deliberation, this finding has informed an ECOFIN Council conclusion. And in that Council conclusion, so the Economic and Financial Affairs Minister joined forces with Ministers of Employment and Social Affairs in what was called a Jumbo Council. And the discussion there centered on the transformative impact of social investment and reforms in economic growth and fiscal sustainability. Of course, the ministers, they exchanged success stories of recent reforms in their countries, reforms that have catalyzed growth, success, and also less successful stories. They looked at the different way and what is the sort of consensus that we can say it was reached. Probably three elements. One is that productivity is key to competitiveness. That's not particularly new, but it explains why a priority that the President von der Leyen next Commission why this is a priority of the President von der Leyen next Commission. Second is that social investment and reforms are pivotal tools to reignite Europe's productivity and innovative spirit. And I insist the link between social investment and productivity and innovation is quite strong. And then third, the minister issued a very clear call to action, to innovate, to research, to develop. They advocated for education upskilling, reskilling, active labor market policies. This is exactly what my colleagues in my Directorate General and myself and many of us here, many of you here, I suspect, this is what we share among us. But not only we share the need for that, but hopefully we also share the same sense of urgency and passion for these themes. These themes are not, let's say, by definition, immediately creating a drama, but they are exactly the sort of things that over time, if not properly tackled and analyzed, they may create a drama. We believe that the social investment may, of course, amplify human capital, enhance growth potential, and strengthen cohesion across countries and regions of our Europe. So please join us to explore A, what are the most pressing needs, B, what work best, 3, what are the bottlenecks to the delivery of policies, and C, what are the tools and the mechanisms which are at our disposal. So before I hand over again the floor to Carlo to take us through the conference and the first panel, please remind all of you of today we discuss about ESDE, but then on the 5th and 6th of March, we will have a big forum on social policies, on employment, social policies and inclusion at the Hague here in Brussels. So Carlo, the floor is back to you.
So thank you so much, Mario, for those insightful remarks. We'll definitely return to the point about social investment and productivity, since productivity is such an important point in the Draghi report. I'd now like to introduce our panelists for the day. If you can join me on stage. We have Lucio Vinhas de Souza, Business Europe's new Director of Economics, of the Economics Department and the Chief Economist. We have Judith Curtin-Darling, Deputy Secretary General of the Trade Union Industrial. We have Tanguy de Rousseau, Director of the Housing, Cities and Regions Department of the European Investment Bank. And we have Elizabeth Kuiper, Associate Director and Head of the Social Europe and Wellbeing, at the think tank European Policy Center. So please join me in giving them a warm welcome. So I always like to start the panels I'm moderating with a little warm-up round. I just ask you to keep your answer to under a minute. And the question is, how do you think Europe's social model can help in the search for competitiveness, and what are the biggest risks to it? And you don't need to explain, you can just say one of each. Over to you, Lucio.
Many thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to see so many former colleagues from the Commission, including Mario and Lucas over there. On your question, the way that I would approach that is that there is a clear interconnection between the health and productivity of our companies and the affordability of our own social model, which is a point of pride for us in Europe. You cannot think of the European social model separate from the health and productivity of our companies. That's what effectively supports it. So a healthy relationship between a competitive sector and a well-qualified and available labor force is key to this. So the interaction between those two forces is what I think is the key for the future of the European economy.
Okay, great. Over to you, Judith.
Well, fundamentally, our social model is the basis of our future competitiveness, in our view, for many of the reasons that you've just laid out, but also, in addition, the danger that increased inequalities in society are not just economically corrosive, socially corrosive, but they're politically corrosive to the stability of our societies and, by extension, the economy. So investment in the social field and a proper social policy, employment policy agenda is absolutely fundamental. And at the base of that is strong and stable industrial relations, because we can't talk about social investment without linking it to the structures that organise our labour markets and the importance of strong and stable industrial relations in that.
Thank you, Judith. Tanguy?
Yes, thank you. From the perspective of the European Investment Bank, so we finance projects. What we think is that there cannot be any economic growth or conversions, also in terms of cohesion, without social investments. So in as much as we try to accompany the green transition, the digital transition that will boost the productivity, we cannot do that without investing in social investments. Therefore, it is one of our key priorities, and we'll come back to that maybe later on.
Great, perfect. And Elizabeth?
Well, thanks, Carlo, and good afternoon, everyone. I think growth and competitiveness are the right priorities for the next Commission. I think especially if you listen to the latest news coming from the European Central Bank, it's an absolute must to focus on these. However, it needs to go hand in hand indeed with social investment and the well-being of the EU. And I think in that respect it's very important also to let go of the old paradigm of economic priorities versus social Europe. Because oftentimes, especially here in Brussels, we make this a question about competences. And I think we see, especially in light of demographic change, technological acceleration, and environmental change, that indeed it's about human capital. And in my opinion, human capital is one of the enablers of competitiveness. So you cannot separate these. They need to go hand in hand for indeed also an approach that indeed looks at inequality, but also the right investment to not only invest in people's well-being, but also the well-being of our economies.
Perfect. Okay, well, let's start then. Tanguy, the EIB recently published its EU investment survey. What were the main takeaways?
I think I would focus on one takeaway, which I think is critical for today, is the shortage in skilled labor as the main barrier to investment. And from our perspective, when we want to support investment, it is key that we promote the development of skills. We do that by supporting education in many ways. Obviously, we support managing authorities dealing with education from the primary school to university, but we also enlarging the eligibilities of the investment that we support to upskilling, reskilling that the Director General mentioned a few moments ago. So we pretty much supporting the development of those skills of which we have a shortage in Europe.
Okay, well, Lucia, then, I'll ask you whether you also see the same thing from the industry side. I mean, is there a lack of skilled labor? And secondly, is there a preferred method to address this? As in, should the focus be on training up the existing European workforce, or should we be looking abroad for skilled labor? I mean, we know that the US, for example, is such a magnet for talent all across the world. Should Europe be trying to follow a similar path?
Thanks for the question, Carl. I would like to highlight first one thing that Elizabeth just told you, and all of us, which is this artificial opposition between, in the end of the day, capital and labor. This is artificial, we are complementary. Same thing in relation to investment. It's artificial to a degree, think of investment as being social and non-social. Investment, by definition, create opportunities for labor to be employed, for it to develop. So the notion of a separate category of investment that would be non-social is artificial in the end of the day. On your particular questions, we do share the concerns that have just been indicated here, not only in terms of investment. Our last survey actually indicates that a smaller share of European companies is willing to investment in Europe because of our investment climate, but also a consistent problem that they face is first the availability of labor and the qualification of labor. Now, we are at historically low levels of unemployment. As a matter of fact, we have, since the creation of the euro area for the past quarter of a century, the lowest levels of unemployment in the European Union. We have the highest historical levels of European Union labor participation, roughly 76% of our labor force, is already being used, which implies that the margin for us to continue exploiting our pool of labor is logically limited. There are areas in which...
Just on one, I mean,
Please.
couldn't you argue, though, that maybe we're not utilizing the existing labor force in the best way? I mean, maybe if we trained more workers, they could do better jobs, like EV, battery plants, or...
There are two areas in which we can clearly maximize our existing pool of labor. One is the older share of our population, which is still capable of adding labor force. And the second one is endowing them with the human capital to work in new activities. But as you yourself indicated, another key areas for us is how to integrate the, let's put it this way, immigrant share of our labor forces. And there, looking at the examples of the United States is quite revealing. A much larger share of immigrant population in the United States is absorbed via the labor market than in Europe, in which the first port of call, in a way, is our social system. For us to change this equation would be another way for us to increase the way in which we can support European growth and social inclusion in the European Union.
Judith, I'd like to go over to you, because if I'm understanding what Lucio said right now, I mean, one interpretation would be to pull back on the welfare state in order that these migrant arrivals join the labor force. Maybe I'm misquoting him here, but Judith, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's exactly the wrong, if that's the way that you're posing the question.
Then Lucio respond
it's not
after,
exactly what, it's not the way that he said it, but I think what we have to be very clear about is when you look, and there's extensive research from DG Employment, from the Dublin Foundation, from CEDIFOP and other European agencies, when you look at where the highest skill shortages are in the European economy, these are in professions and sectors with, in many cases, the worst working conditions. And the quality of work is absolutely crucial if we're going to really address the question of skills shortages. Skill shortages is a different debate to labor shortages, and sometimes the two things are mixed together. And there's definitely a discussion to have in terms of labor shortages. We have it very actively this afternoon. I've just come from the chemical sector social dialogue, where we have we're in a very difficult economic situation, very turbulent times, massive transition in every direction. But at the same time that you have industries and energy-intensive industries and other manufacturing industries which are undergoing enormous transitions, you also have skills gaps, labor shortages. And there is an opportunity actually to look at how we diversify workforces where there are labor shortages and skill shortages, opening up ways of creating workplaces which are more family-friendly, which are more female-friendly, opportunities for young people to enter into the workforce, ensuring that people aren't absolutely exhausted and end up in long-term sick situations because of the intensity of work, which is a problem in many European countries where we have very high levels of people who are in long-term sick situations. This is about dealing with the quality of work. And if we're not having a kind of comprehensive conversation about skill shortages and labor shortages, it's not just about upskilling and retraining. We have to take a comprehensive approach if we're really going to address some of the root causes of the issues that we face. But having said that, just as a very short last comment, clearly migration is part of the story. That's absolutely clear, but it has to be on the basis of equal treatment and good working conditions also for people from outside the European Union working in the European labour market.
Exactly. The point that I would like to make is that the way that you formulated it will almost sound like if Politico doesn't think that we should integrate migrants via the labour market, which is both logically and morally indefensible.
No, sure. I mean, I guess the point I was making is if we look at the American model, it's a system where I think it's fair to say comparatively less welfare than at least many European countries. And maybe that's also a kind of way to integrate people into the workforce. Not saying that we should do that, but Elizabeth, in your opinion, where should policymakers be looking at to invest money to upskill the workforce? And how do we go about this? I mean, we see very rapid technological change, most of it not emanating from Europe. We're kind of on the receiving end of it. How can we adapt the labor market to fit into this new future we're going into, and hopefully also make it so that Europe can start to become one of the sources of that technological change and not just be receiving it from the US?
I'd like to start, and I think that's also partly continue the conversation that you started, is we also really need to take into account the demographic transition in all of this, because I think we're forgetting, and we saw this coming a long time, that in the EU we're with an aging population. We're not yet super aging like they are in Japan, for example, but the fact that people are aging has already an impact on the labor market. I mean, I was reading the other day that for older adults between 55 and 59, it's apparently minus 80% labor participation. So I think all of this also means that we need to come up with more flexible arrangements, a better work-life balance, but clearly also indeed upskilling and reskilling targeted in its age criteria, because we know that indeed older workers have different needs than younger workers. So I think when it comes indeed to your question about what skills do we need, I think we know all the answers from the studies from DG Employment. Of course, there's vocational educational training, there's upskilling and reskilling. But I think another element, apart from demographic, is also, of course, regional cohesion. And I think there also other investment in social investment comes in, because issues, for example, like housing, like you mentioned, that's not only a matter, for example, of energy, the energy transition, etc. There's also an element of talent shortages, because if younger people have problems finding the right place to live in bigger cities, that has an impact also on the labor market. So it's all very much linked, as you say. You cannot only look at skills, it's also really that broader context of the labor conditions that come in place.
Okay, well, Tange, maybe you want to elaborate on that point. I saw you nodding, especially at the regional aspect, but I'll just leave it open to you.
Yeah, thank you, Carlo. I think one of the key to social development is to take into account the territorial development dimension. Because, as you say, people need to be able to find accommodation, need to be able to commute to the workplace, and all of that is not possible if we don't develop the territories as well. And when I mean territorial development, I mean half of what we finance now, it's a bit like climate, half of the volumes financed by the bank are towards cohesion regions. So it is key, and it's not only social infrastructure that we need to develop, it's also digital infrastructure, it's also transport infrastructure, because that's what will attract population in the territories. That's where we will have a balanced population in the territories, and that's what will allow social development of the population, whether it is skills, but also their own economic development, quality of life, as you say, that people live in good working conditions, but also good living conditions because of the transport infrastructure, public transport infrastructure. It is one of the key priorities that participate at the same time to the green transition, so sustainable transport, but also to the social dimension, is promote accessibility to wider population.
What do you think of the argument, though, that Europe is already too diffuse, that there's too many, let's say, separate economic centers, and we would do better to kind of aggregate more like the United States does, where you have like LA, you have New York, you have maybe, Texas, it's less fragmented, let's say.
Yeah. Well, there would be a temptation to focus on the large metropolis, especially for housing. But one of the key aspects that we pay attention to when we support housing projects is that we don't want to support urban sprawl. What is very important is that we also finance housing in the smaller cities, in other places. And when we mean housing and affordable housing, not only big, large apartment flats, but also smaller housing dwellings, more akin to individual houses, but the focus being on affordability and accessibility to the wider population.
Okay, great. I did want to return to the question of the labor market because, forgive me here, but you two were looking a bit too much in agreement, so I wanted to create. So maybe, Lucia, we can start with you again. I mean, as I mentioned in my introductory speech, coming out of the great financial crisis, the word competitiveness was often kind of a byword for restructuring of the labor market along the lines I described. I actually went to read some of Mario Draghi's old speeches from the ECB, and he used competitiveness in this way, you know, especially with regards to countries like Italy, which hadn't done those reforms that maybe Germany had done at the beginning of the millennium. So what do you think of the current situation of European labor markets? Are they flexible enough for the needs of industry, or do you think we also need to kind of revive this concept a bit of, you know, these more liquid labor markets, making it easier to shift jobs and so on?
If you allow me one initial comment, that's not the reading that I have or that my organization has about competitiveness at all. Competitiveness is the capacity of European companies and European economies to innovate and grow. And one of the great constraints for us not to be capable of doing that is the fragmented nature of our single market. We innovate, but we don't turn the innovation that we create as something marketable. That's our real problem. On your particular question, I think that is undeniable for us to think in terms of the significant costs and rigidities that we have in terms of the tax wedge in relation to our own labor markets. I can give you one small example. The costs in terms of hiring new labor from the point of view of one European company, compared to implicitly suggested to use the United States as a benchmark, are almost twice as high. The tax wedge for a low level of wage in the European Union is close to 50%. In the United States, it's roughly half of that.
Can you define tax wedge?
Is how much you have to pay as a company in additional costs beyond what you are paying as the salary for the person that you just hired. That, by definition, makes it much more costly from the point of view of a company when we hire new labor. This said, we have remarkably robust labor markets, record low unemployment, and a record high level of labor force participation. We, of course, would appreciate greater capacity to have more flexible labor markets, but what is the real question here from our point of view are the costs related for us to hire new labor. The costs of the tax wedge is really one of the things which are more complex from our point of view.
Okay, great. Judith.
Yeah, I mean,
No, I actually was going to ask a separate question.
But I kind of want to come back, but maybe you're not allowed to ask questions of the moderator. This is
No,
like
please
totally
ask a
unacceptable.
question, and
But
it's a very
I
loose
think it's a
format.
really misjudged direction to constantly make a direct comparison between the US and Europe. In Europe, we have longer life expectancy. We are healthier, we are more educated, we are more equal, we're more socially cohesive, even if there are challenges that we face. All of that is as a result of the social investment or the welfare state, or however we want to define our European social model. And this very arbitrary comparison between Europe and the US in some respects completely disregards that broader context. And I think it's really important just to kind of put that on the table. It's no surprise that if you invite an employers organization and you ask them, are European labor markets flexible enough, or would you like some more flexibility? I don't think you would be doing your job correctly. You probably, I don't know how long your probation period is in Business Europe, but there would be a question. There would be a question about that. But what I think is really interesting is that some lessons have been learned since the great financial crash in 2008, 2009. where we saw the absolute power of good organized labor markets and strong industrial relations, which meant that those countries which had the institutional framework and the policy framework in place were able to recover far quicker once all of the other economic factors came into play. And what's been striking in the context of the pandemic is how quickly, with the development, and there I applaud the European institutions and the European social partners, the ETUC and others, but the creation of the SURE program of recognizing the importance of short-time work and labor market measures to avoid that you lose the labor force during crash. And what we're seeing today in Europe is behind that line of flexible labor markets is that we have thousands and thousands of workers in our sectors who are now continuously subject to short-time work. To create a level of flexibility in the case of increases and reductions in production. That is how labor markets work well. It means that you protect the workers impacted, but it also means that you don't lose the skills, and it means you don't lose the skills for the companies in the case of a downturn. So I think it's really important to kind of just factor this in. We have things in Europe which aren't available in the US. At the same time, the US has innovated in the same period in ways which we haven't innovated. And where we haven't making your link to these false silos, economic policy, social policy, capital, labor, where the US has been really innovative is how you use industrial policy to pursue an improvement in labor market policy. So the social conditionalities in the CHIPS Act, the social conditionalities in the IRA and the Infrastructure Act have allowed a way of addressing some of the fundamental weaknesses in the US system. And actually, there are some things there for us to learn in Europe to deal with some of the longer-term demographic and other challenges that we face in our own economy. And we should be looking at those elements, I think, rather than looking at can we hire or fire cheaper or not here or there.
This is a discussion between capital and labor. I obviously know that that's not your point. Thanks for complimenting companies in keeping labor during the dark days.
It's been super important for our members.
Has been a duty from our part. Benchmarks are important. We have benchmarks within the European Union itself. I am a Portuguese. The labor market in Portugal works significantly different than the labor market in Ireland, for instance. We can learn from each other. The usage of the United States as one possible benchmark. It's because there are lessons that we can learn in all sorts of areas, as we can learn from the Denmark, we can learn from the Netherlands, we can learn from France. We learn from each other, right? The existence of benchmarks is obviously not something that we should be questioning here.
Okay, great. I want to give the other panelists a chance to speak as well. So I wanted to go back to you, Tange, because you mentioned some of the work that the EIB has been doing. But I get the sense that there's discussions around what the EIB could do more, coming out of the Draghi report, where Europe is looking for this funding to try and do some kind of restructuring of the economy. Obviously, the EIB sits there with some cash. There's many other sources of funding as well. How do you see the role of the EIB evolving in terms of this push to boost productivity?
Yeah, thank you, Carlo. I think it's a very important question. We could have a look at it saying that we finance one-to-one. I mean, that the EIB finances a project on its own on a bilateral basis. That's what we've done for a long time. It's been very efficient, very sizable as well. But now we're asked to do more, and I think that's fair enough because we can do more. But doing more means doing it more with the Commission, doing it more with the Member States, with the national promotional banks. And I'd like to introduce the concept of these financial instruments, but whereby we would blend some grant resources, most probably coming from the Commission's cohesion funds, possibly, and lending and by doing that, having a leverage effect that would attract private investors to support investment. And that's what we're looking at doing at the moment for housing.
Would that be like a de-risking model, or?
Sorry?
Would that be a de-risking model, or?
It's partly de-risking, because if you have a grant element, of course, for the lenders, you de-risk the exposure that they will take. But I think it's a question of teaming up, converging, not trying to solve a problem on our own.
And what areas in particular are you looking to work with the Commission on?
Well, at the moment, the very hot topic, as you know, is housing.
Housing.
Okay. We joined a conference in Milan on Monday this week with Housing Europe. We organize our own second or third technical workshop still in Milan with the entire community. I think 4 DGs from the Commission were represented. We had at least 3 of the national promotional banks also attending this conference, and many promoters, financiers as well. And I think if I was to go 2 conclusions which are relevant for today, is the first one is that we need to do it together to have this leverage effect and be able to attract more financing to support social investments. And the second one would be that it is very much, and I think it's a common trend for social investments, pretty much a local issue. And we cannot address it only centrally with nice measures. So, I mean, the EIB is very humble because we are policy takers, we're not policy makers here. But still, we found out during this conference and technical workshops that social investment is a local issue to solve, and therefore we also need to involve managing authorities, whether they are for healthcare or education or housing.
And just on the housing, because I find this quite interesting. So would the idea be that you then work with local real estate developers to develop housing, or are you providing loans to the developers?
I think we need to work on the supply side more than on the demand side, because the supply, we're short of supply at the moment, and the question of affordability means that, well, just in simple business terms, I mean, you need to increase the offer, and that's where we could support property developers, well, social housing property developers. We are not into supporting speculation. We're here for the common good from the EIB perspective, but it could be social housing companies. There could be a private dimension in that as well.
Okay, great. Oh, thanks so much for that. Elizabeth, I wanted to ask whether you agreed with the comments I made at the introducing the panel, where I said that I got the impression that maybe the idea of a social Europe had been slightly downgraded in this latest, the new commission. We've seen the mission letters now, you know, and the focus has shifted more to growth because of this fear of lagging behind. Is that the way you see it, or do you think I'm missing the mark there?
It's an interesting question, because indeed I think when the mission letters indeed were sent to the commissioners, I think a lot of noise was made around the fact indeed the word social was missing. And on the one hand, language is important, so it may indicate something. On the other hand, to perhaps give the incoming commission that now will start on the 1st of December the benefit of the doubt, if indeed this is about the right social investment, and indeed also a whole of government approach, because I think what I find really interesting in town, if I speak with stakeholders, that perhaps on paper the structure of the Commission, which seems to be less in silos and more of an interactive nature between the different parts of the Commission, it looks good on paper. Perhaps the Machiavellian in me says that we need to see if this is going to work out, because I think it is really important to keep all these elements that we're discussing today together. Because even what you just said, a lot of social investment indeed takes place at the local level, because housing, healthcare, education, that is always oftentimes up to indeed the local or the regional level. But I think the fact that we see an investment gap shows that financing is not sufficient. And if this commission is serious about being an investment commission, it should not only be investment from a business perspective, it should also about the right mix of public-private investment. And it's true, and I think you hinted to it, For example, in the United States, there is much more money available also for innovation. And if we listen to Draghi, who told us in his 400 pages that indeed investment in research and development is an investment in growth and people's well-being, that also means that we need to have the right funds. So what I really hope, also in light of the MFF, so the multi-annual financial negotiations next year, that indeed funds will not be slashed, but rather increased. Because also on housing, the public sector alone will not make this happen. We need to have the private sector stepping in. And I think that goes for a lot of other sectors as well. And if you then listen also to the Finnish president, former Finnish president Niinisto, who says that, for example, investment in preparedness, for example, in healthcare, is also investing in competitiveness. I think that shows you that if you have the right approach, and you put these elements together, and you have that sort of whole of government approach, if I keep calling it, then it's social in outcome. So again, then the word social per se is not, saying it all, but I think the outcome should be social, and that for me is very important.
Sure. Judith, I wanted to ask you about what you see as the role of labor, of trade unions, in this new economic era, if we can call it that we're entering here. I mean, clearly there's been a shift since the pandemic as to regards to how we view the role of the state and markets and the general economy. I found it quite interesting that if we looked at the United States elections, the role of organized labor seemed to have increased somewhat after a long period of decline, I think it's fair to say. And this was both true on the left and on the right. I mean, we saw at the Republican National Convention, for example, that the Teamsters Union, the truck drivers, were there. So, yeah, what do you see as the role of trade unions? You seem to be cooperating quite well with Capital on this panel. Do you think this role has changed?
Well, I think that trade unions and organised labour is fundamentally important to a civilised democratic society. Workplace democracy, industrial democracy is the foundation of wider democracy. You can't have parliamentary democracy without having a functioning industrial relations system as well. So I wouldn't be here suggesting that trade unions' days are over and that we'll leave the stage quietly. That's not definitely not part of the mix. In fact, I think that the role of social dialogue and collective bargaining is only going to increase because of the turbulence that we face as a result of, what some people call the polycrisis, what some people call the mixture of megatrends that are hitting us all at the same time. That demands extremely strong social dialogue at different levels, from the workplace up to the European level, and many would argue the international level as well in terms of the UN system. So trade unions, therefore, have their place in all of it. But if I go back to make the link more concretely, so it's more tangible, if you think about this model of using public funds to leverage in private funds to promote the development of public goods or to complete the needs that we have, then that's where the importance of these social conditionalities becomes really key. And one of the crucial social conditionalities is around collective agreements. And if we take a whole government approach to this next 5 years of the European Commission, then we would see the instruments of the different parts of the Commission playing together. You would see an industrial policy which promoted European value chains, supporting the investment in housing across Europe, which would create good quality jobs in manufacturing across Europe, would support the industries which at the moment are really struggling, whether that's the steel industry, the cement industry, chemicals, other sectors and energy-intensive industries, manufactured goods, capital goods, and so on. Then you would also see the link with the collective bargaining framework and the European Adequate Minimum Wages Directive, where member states have signed up to a collective bargaining coverage of 80%, tie those social conditionalities to the EIB grants, and you basically turbocharge the accomplishment of European employment legislation, employment rules which are already on the table. This is a way of actually delivering the public goods, but also a stronger economic model. And we won't always agree. You know, negotiations mean neither of us will leave the table completely happy. If one of us leaves more happy than the other, then it's an imbalanced negotiations. Everybody has to be angry when they leave the negotiations feeling that they gave something up. Or they have to feel like they gave something up. That's a sign of mature, strong social dialogue. But it's absolutely crucial in the current situation. And what we are missing from the table, the social conditionalities on the public funding, but what's fundamentally missing in this massive turbulence is then conditionalities around the transition. And that's where you link then to this question of the labour shortages, skills shortages, enforce that companies benefiting from public funds, public contracts, auctions, also have to have transition plans in place, and you really start to build up as a kind of plan which brings the bits together.
To you, Tanguy. I mean, are you looking at this issue of social conditionalities in your funding? I know the IRA obviously had some, we saw it with the battery plants, for example.
Yeah, maybe just to correct you, Judith, we don't provide grants, but loans, so financing.
Sorry.
Sorry,
Yes.
yeah, no, sorry, it was misspeaking.
Yes.
We know our friends for grants, but
Yeah,
it's not as directly.
that was my mistake.
On the conditionality, indeed, when the EIB finances a project, it looks at eligibilities, and the eligibility are those safeguards that we apply social standards, that we make sure that the investment is geared towards, for example, in housing. If we're talking about affordability, we're working, and that's one of the work streams at the moment, on eligibility of affordable housing. What does it mean? And I think here, I'd like to think that we need to take a wider view, not only income criteria, but we could talk about vulnerable populations. I think you mentioned that at the beginning. And there are different sorts of vulnerability. It could be social conditions, but it could be just a situation at a point in time. At the moment, I think, relating again to the housing crisis, the younger generation find it very difficult to find accommodation in the large cities. And these are therefore vulnerable population in some form, even though they may be employed, maybe the two of them would be working, and still they can't find accommodation. So in answer to your question, Carlo, and rebounding on what you said, Judith, I think, yes, indeed, the EIB has social eligibility criteria in whatever we finance.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to read out a comment by Jared Humer from SME United. It's not a question, but I think maybe one of you can respond to it, because I think it's possibly a true point, which is that social policies can support competitiveness. However, there are also measures with negative impact on productivity, like heavy regulations and inactivity traps. And I do get the sense that this is something that the new commission is thinking a lot about. I mean, I believe that the Commissioner Dombrovskis, for example, he has like cutting red tape among his mandate. With the incoming Trump administration, they've also created a new department to cut red tape. So, yeah, I mean, what do you think of this trend? I mean, it's an interesting mix, because on the one hand, it seems like the state is playing a more prominent role, doing more investment. Organizations like the EIB presumably will be lending more money. At the same time, we also see a renewed focus on, cutting bureaucratic hurdles to business. So it's...
If you allow me to
please.
take that, and I reply directly
Sure,
to my counterpart at SME United, Gerhard. It is clear that there are regulatory questions that have humbled not only social questions and employment creation, but also economic growth in general. I'll give you a practical example. During the current political cycle, we had over 13,000 new regulations put on the top of the European private sector, from questions related to environmental, to energy related, to regulatory matters, to transfers of assets between individual member states. This clearly has implications in terms of what you can do as a company, and therefore what we can do in terms of growth, investment, and in terms of job creation. Therefore, it seems clear to us that a focus of the next Commission should be in terms of the harmonization of the quote-unquote regulatory tsunami that has been unleashed on us during the previous political cycle, and in terms of the harmonization of these type of regulations. I'll give you one small example, talking about a company that we discussed in terms of their regulatory filings, which went from roughly 30 pages in the end of the previous cycle to over 230 in the current one. This is a concrete cost for the company in and of itself. And we're not talking here necessarily about deregulation, but at least the harmonization of different overlapping levels of regulation, which in some cases were imposed in a frankly uncoordinated fashion by different departments of European Union institutions. That is going to be one of the questions that we expect from the mission letters for the next political cycle. The future Commissioner Dombrovskis, who is going to be responsible for both the regulatory checks, the competitiveness funds, and the regulatory dialogues, is going to be one of the main counterparts and responsible for those initiatives.
We have 2 minutes, Elizabeth.
There's an element that I would like to add, because I mean, regulation, of course, is important. It's always important to find the right balance of not abusing regulations, but having also that sort of flexibility also for people and actors to use them. But I think another element which is really important when it comes to social investment, and I think is a very sort of classic conversation, is that we need to be clear what it is delivering, if it's actually delivering for people what it promises to deliver. And I think also there in the new Commission, I hope that the European semester will be used also in a much broader way, because, for example, when it comes to affordable housing, if we include that as an indicator in the European semester, then at some point we will also be able to measure if indeed we're getting better in it. And we know, of course, that at some point, I think it was back in 2011, the semester was a purely fiscal instrument, and over time it has been expanded. But I think it is really important also on social investment that we're really clear what we're measuring. Because over time, and that's often with administration the case, there have been so many funds. We have the European Social Fund, the Climate Fund, we had the RFF, there's many more. And all of them partly try to deliver on social outcomes. And I think if indeed I hear, and again, this is a bit sort of grapevine rumors at the time being, but that there will be clustering of funds. I mean, again, I think we need to be clear that that doesn't mean that we're cutting funds as such, like pure cutting. But I think if that leads to perhaps a better understanding of what social investment delivers, I think that's a very important development then.
Great. Yeah, you have 10
1
seconds.
second, 10 seconds. I just want to reiterate the point that you made at the beginning, that a campaign just against regulation is also not in the interest of European competitiveness. So, because regulation is also a driver of innovation in many cases, and actually amongst our employer counterparts, when we go and we meet the Commission, we hear all of the demands for new regulations that they want to see, lead markets, standards on different things. This is more regulation. Unfortunately, the things that are often at the top of the pile in better regulation are the things which protect workers and the environment. And so we have to be very careful about the terms of this debate on regulation.
Okay, well,
correct the problems caused by previous regulatory ways.
You added 10 seconds.
okay. Well, we are out of time. I'd like to say thank you to all of our panelists for that, I think, spirited but harmonious discussion, all things considered. You know, we have a lot to think about, in particular with regards to how social investment can be used most effectively. I mean, I think what I saw was agreement on the idea that we don't want to kind of like dismember our social model and become a bad copy of the United States, but at the same time, we need to think carefully of how to best use this money in a way that we preserve what we have, but we can also advance on some of the areas we're falling behind. We'll also take a quick look at the poll, which is, oh, it's behind me, I think, so I'll look at it here. So the poll was, what's the best tool to boost the EU's employment rate and productivity? And the result is, social investment wins at 31%, and that's followed by training and education at 28%. Okay, and finally, I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us, as well as you, the audience, for everyone joining in person and online. And I'd like to thank our partner, DG AMP, for making this event possible. Stay tuned for the other deep dive sessions that are happening throughout the afternoon on the topic. And if you like this spotlight session and want to know more about Politico live events, check out our website to see all the policy and politics events which you can attend. And as always, we love to hear your feedback, so please email us at live@politico.eu. Thanks so much.
Gentlemen, we were supposed to have a Politico mini video, which appeared only here, so you could not see it, but no problem. So we're now breaking for coffee, indeed, for 20 minutes. So please be back here at 3:50. And if you're following us online, stay tuned. We have 2 more sessions coming up, which are going to go deeper into the issues, so I'm sure you'll be interested. See you in 20 minutes. Thank you.